Hello, dear listeners. Tonight, I am taking you out of the dusty pages of history and bringing you to the coldest, most bone-chilling reality of the Middle Ages. I want you to forget the magnificent, warm, sparkling castle life you see in Hollywood movies. Because the reality behind the curtain is much more brutal. Visualize it. Nobles shivering between massive stone walls despite their layers of fur. Those freezing rooms where wine glasses forgotten on the table freeze and thin ice crystals sparkle on bed covers in the mornings. Spending a winter in medieval castles is not a lifestyle, but a pure struggle for survival. Behind those night tales romanticized by historians lies the raw, frozen story of people trying to live in a stone labyrinth at -10 degrees. What you will hear tonight reveals the freezing cold behind those thick, showy curtains and the silent struggle given for a cup of hot soup in all its nakedness. Welcome to the Another Life History channel. If you enjoy witnessing this unfiltered, real face of history, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to join us on this journey. Do not neglect to write in the comments from where in the world you are listening to me right now and how hard the wind is blowing outside. Perhaps you are currently under a soft blanket in a safe and warm room. You are listening to this story in much more comfortable conditions than medieval lords and those mighty kings. Now, dim the lights. Settle well into where you are, drop your shoulders and relax. Let's go on a journey together to those freezing stone walls, fireplaces burning with a faint hope, and the noble life fighting against the killing breath of winter. Because the secrets you will learn tonight will make you feel the coldest face of history. Imagine waking up suddenly on a dark, stormy winter night. You feel that inevitable call of nature. Today, this means going to your warm bathroom just a few steps away. But in the 14th century, if you lived in that massive stone-walled castle, this simple call could literally turn into a matter of life and death. Going to the toilet in medieval castles is not an ordinary need. It is a dangerous adventure requiring courage, strategy, and endurance. The latrine systems, which are the least spoken about but perhaps the most critical reality of castle life, are full of difficulties that the modern mind cannot grasp. Those nobles feasting in magnificent halls and wearing glittering armor risk their lives to relieve these needs during the most vulnerable moments of the day. This system is located in special small cubicles called garde-robe. The name sounds familiar, doesn't it? It means wardrobe in French, because people also hang their most valuable clothes in these smelly rooms. The reason is quite practical. The sharp ammonia smell rising from the waste keeps fleas and moths away from silk fabrics. So, the safest place of that era becomes the worst smelling place. These cubicles are generally built as small towers projecting outward from the castle walls, like a bird's nest, into the void. Think of entering inside. A narrow, freezing space. In the middle, a wooden seat, and underneath, a dark hole opening directly outside the castle into that terrible void. Waste flows through this gap. It falls into castle moats, rivers, or at the mercy of the wind to the bottom of the walls. Neither a filter, nor a sewage system, nor hygiene. Everything mixes with nature in its wildest form. When winter months arrive, this system turns into a complete nightmare. First, that freezing cold. The wooden seat resembles a marble block cut into ice. Touching that surface with bare skin causes the skin to stick, or even creates a risk of frostbite. Rich families cover the seats with animal furs to alleviate this torture, and even have their servants place hot stones to warm that area beforehand. But the only problem is not the cold surfaces. The wind. that ruthless winter wind. The storm battering the castle walls gushes up from that open hole with a chimney effect and practically freezes the person sitting there. This is not just a comfort issue. That freezing airflow invites kidney inflammations, bladder infections, and fatal diseases, especially the obligation to go to the toilet at midnight. It is like a complete horror movie scene. Castles take on a completely different, uncanny identity after the sun sets. Pitch-dark corridors, flickering shadows of torches about to die out, and unexplained sounds echoing on stone walls. In this labyrinth, trying to reach that ice-cold garderobe room with a trembling candle in your hand requires great courage. Falling on slippery floors, losing your way, or facing the hums coming from that dark void. Even worse is a moment of siege. For enemy soldiers, these small garderobe towers projecting from the castle wall constitute perfect targets. In history, there are many nobles who lost their lives by an enemy arrow coming from below while relieving a need at their most vulnerable moment. The hygiene issue is terrible enough to challenge the imagination. Toilet paper? Of course there is none. Instead, stiff piles of straw, dried leaves, old pieces of fabric, or if you are lucky, some wool is used. Water for cleaning is ice-cold and limited. Soap is considered a luxury worthy only of kings. One of the greatest shames experienced between those thick walls of the castle is the arrival of this need during a crowded banquet. Social rules are so strict that leaving the king's table to go to the toilet is considered a great disrespect. Therefore, lords and ladies wait in pain for hours and endanger their health. For women, the situation is even more agonizing. Imagine trying to fit into that narrow, frozen cubicle with layers of heavy velvet dresses, corsets, and cloaks. Moving is almost impossible. Especially for pregnant women, reaching these cubicles is as hard as climbing a mountain. Therefore, most women prefer to use simple vessels called night chamber pots in the corner of their rooms. Another disaster brought by winter is the frozen waste problem. The waste falling down from that deep void freezes on the wall surface and piles up, turning into giant icicles. When they start to melt with the spring sun, an unbearable throat-burning smell surrounds the castle, and epidemic diseases knock on the door. And of course, security. The stonework of those castles, standing for centuries, gets tired over time. These makeshift cubicles extending from the castle wall into the void sometimes cannot carry the weight of the person on them and collapse down with a great noise. The chance of survival for someone who is there at that moment is almost zero. For enemies, these holes are a disgusting but effective way to infiltrate the castle. The darkest assassination stories of history are full of soldiers climbing through these narrow and filthy channels to infiltrate the castle and catch the nobles at their most vulnerable moments. Using that small room in medieval castles means facing cold, darkness, disease, and the fear of death. Now, think of the comfort in your modern home and appreciate those seemingly simple luxuries you have. While the uncanny darkness of the night slowly leaves its place to a grey dawn, life starts again in the castle. Before the first sunlight hits the cold stone walls, even when the sky is pitch black, a secret, silent operation comes into play for those living in the castle. This is not an awakening, but almost a sacred ceremony, a delicate process where a single mistake can lead to the Lord's wrath or the disruption of order. These little-known morning rituals of castle life operate with a strict hierarchy and timing. In that large bedroom on the top floor, the awakening of the Lord and his family is planned like a theatre scene. The Lord's most trusted, most private servant, the valet de chambre, has learned to glide into the room silently like a ghost without interrupting his master's sleep. Inside is freezing. The valet's first duty is to give life to the extinguished fireplace. The slightest crackle while placing dry wood can wake the lord before his time. Therefore, holding his breath, he ensures only the soft rustle of the fire is heard. When the room starts to warm up slowly and the orange light of the flames dances on the stone walls, the valet approaches his master's massive bed. This moment is the most critical point of the ritual, never by shaking or with a loud voice. First, he reveals his presence with a light, gentle cough. Then he says the stereotyped words repeated for centuries, like, "My lord, a new day is starting," in a tone close to a whisper. With the Lord opening his eyes, life does not start immediately. Even getting out of bed depends on a protocol. First, one sits in bed, the morning prayer is whispered, then the strategy of the day is discussed with the valet. Meanwhile, other servants in the background prepare the clothes with silent steps as if there is no gravity, and send secret signals to the kitchen for a hot breakfast. While the storm continues outside, this silent and warm order inside is perhaps the greatest privilege of being a medieval noble. While the Lord's room is managed with a silent discipline, the lady's awakening ceremony becomes much more complex. Her special female servant is obliged to coordinate her mistress's beauty routines and clothing preparations. Waking up for the lady does not just mean getting out of bed, but also means preparing the first look of the day. Hair arranging, face care, and the selection of those layered dresses turn into a long process starting in the early hours of the morning. Children are subject to different awakening routines according to their ages. Young princes and princesses are woken up by their nannies with special songs and fairy tales. This is not just a show of affection, but also a psychological method that ensures children become ready in terms of morale at the beginning of the day. For knights and nobles, the awakening ritual carries a more military character. These warriors, who get up even before the morning call to prayer, do training and preparation in the first hours of the day. Armor checks, weapon maintenance, and horse preparation are an integral part of morning routines. For the servant class, the awakening system works completely differently. The lowest level servants get up in the last hours of the night and start working to make the whole castle ready before dawn. Kitchen servants light the fires, cleaning staff sweep the corridors, gardeners feed the animals. The most mysterious part of the door-knocking ritual is that strict rule system regarding who can knock on which doors. Servants cannot knock on the Lord's door directly. This duty belongs only to high-ranking butlers. Likewise, lower-level officials do not even have permission to approach the lady's room. There are different knocking styles and codes for every door. 3 light taps indicate an emergency, 2 long taps indicate normal service, and a single strong tap indicates the arrival of an important guest. This code system is so developed that experienced castle residents can understand who is coming and for what purpose just from the sound of the door. The hardest part of the morning awakening ceremonies is the necessity of silence. While the majority of the castle residents are still sleeping, servants have to make all their preparations without making a sound. Everything from footsteps to conversations, from the squeak of a door to the sounds of carrying items, is under strict control. In winter months, these rituals become even harder. The cold air causes sounds to echo more clearly on the stone walls. Also, the longer duration of darkness increases the use of candles and torches. This means a risk of fire at any moment. Servants try not to neglect their duties while being careful not to fall from the ice-covered stairs. Religious rituals are also an important part of the morning. The morning service in the castle chapel is a sacred moment that unites everyone around a common purpose. the sounds of bells reach every corner of the castle and announce the official beginning of the day. Dining hall preparation is the most critical part of morning rituals. Table arrangement, food temperature, and service timing must be perfect. The moment the Lord and his family sit at the breakfast table, all preparations must be completed. Security checks are also among the indispensable parts of morning routines. The handover process from night watchmen to day sentries carries vital importance for the continuity of castle security. Door checks, rampart wall inspection, and weapon depot checks are repeated meticulously every morning. One of the most interesting rituals is the weather forecast. Experienced castle residents try to guess the weather of the day by observing the sky, the direction of the wind, and animal behaviors. This information is quite important for the planning of daily work. The social dimension of morning awakening ceremonies is also quite remarkable. During these rituals, daily gossip is shared among castle residents, new news spreads, and social bonds strengthen. While servant women whisper in the kitchen, male servants gather in the stables. The dawn rituals in medieval castles form an extremely complex and detailed system when looked at with today's eyes. Living through these morning ceremonies, where every movement is calculated, every sound is controlled, and every behavior is suitable for protocol, is a challenging experience requiring discipline and harmony. Now, imagine approaching that magnificent dining table standing in the middle of the great hall. The smell hitting your nose is not that delicious food aroma you expect. A wave of nauseating smell formed by a mixture of soured wine, moldy bread, and meat of uncertain origin welcomes you. Welcome to medieval castle tables. This is a world where hunger is stronger than luxury, and survival comes before the pleasure of taste. The drama experienced in castle kitchens during winter months has nothing to do remotely or closely with those flashy banquets shown in Hollywood movies. The truth is, finding fresh food during the winter season that lasts for months in freezing cold is almost impossible. Castle residents try to survive with canned foods they prepared in summer, with salted meats, and with foods of extremely suspicious quality left to their luck. The wine story is particularly pathetic. Large wine barrels are stored in castle cellars and literally freeze on those cold days. While frozen wine thaws, the fermentation process breaks down, the drink sours and becomes undrinkable. But since there is no other option, this soured liquid, sometimes turned into vinegar, still takes its place on the tables. Even rich nobles try to drink their frozen wine by heating it and adding plenty of spices. The meat issue is even more terrible. Meats that are tried to be preserved with salting and drying methods become unrecognizable by the end of winter. While too much salt hardens the meat like a mummy, too little leads to rotting. Often, cooks have to taste the meat to understand if it is spoiled or not. Meats whose color has faded, smell has become heavy, and texture has changed are tried to be hidden under piles of intense spices and sauces. The bread situation is perhaps the most tragic one. Due to dampness and cold, breads mold very quickly. The green parts of moldy breads are scraped off, and the remaining pieces are tried to be baked again. Sometimes mold spreads so much that more than half of the breads have to be thrown away. In this case, castle residents have to eat that hard bread made with strange mixtures mixed with corn flour, bitter herbs, and even wood sawdust. Dairy products are a complete gamble. When cheeses are too hard, they are tried to be cut with a saw, and when they are too soft, they spoil by emitting a bad smell. Butter usually takes on a bitter taste, and milk sours immediately. Cooks try various methods to save these products, but often the result is a great disappointment. The vegetable situation is even worse. It is impossible to find fresh vegetables in the middle of winter. The rotten parts of vegetables like onions, carrots and cabbages stored in castle barns are cut and thrown away, and the remaining solid parts are used in meals. Sometimes, after cleaning the rotten part, the remaining piece becomes so small that it can only be used to give flavor. The fish subject is particularly absurd. Salted fish harden like stone at the end of winter and emit a terrible smell around. To make these fish edible, it is necessary to soak them in water for days, beat them, and add intense spices. In the end, the thing that emerges looks more like a spice pile than fish. The most interesting rescue operations happen in the kitchen. Cooks show incredible creativity to make spoiled foods edible. Rotten meats are boiled for a long time, then fried, then spice piles are added and covered with heavy sauces. The aim is not taste, but just to satisfy that gnawing hunger. In large banquets, the situation takes on a tragicomic state. The host lord, who has to offer the best foods to guests, expects miracles from his cooks. Cooks sweat profusely while trying to create masterpieces with those spoiled ingredients in their hands. In the end, the meals coming to the table can be impressive in appearance, but terrible in taste. For children, the situation is even more pathetic. Their small stomachs cannot handle these heavy, salted and spoiled foods, so they frequently get sick. Mothers try to prepare soft foods for their children, but options are extremely limited. The desperation in the kitchen is not limited to the Lord's table only. Children are often fed only with bread water or very diluted, clear soups. The situation of the servants is much worse. The leftovers of the meals prepared for the nobles and the most spoiled parts are left to them. Even kitchen garbage is considered valuable. The tiniest edible piece is sought within them. Bone broth, dried breadcrumbs and muddy vegetable peels form the main menu of the servant tables. Strange food combinations also emerge in this scarcity. Sweet is mixed with salty, meat is randomly combined with fruit. Strange sauces are tried. Although these mixtures are often nauseating, hunger makes everything edible. The most terrifying moment is the moment when a live insect or worm comes out in the middle of the meal. Stored grains and flours become infested with insects due to dampness. White worms coming out of bread and black insects floating in grain meals become ordinary events. People get so used to this situation that they just pick the insects aside and continue eating. When castle barns become completely empty at the end of winter, the situation gets serious. Those hard grasses and grains normally set aside as animal feed are offered for human consumption. Even in times when hunger blinds the eyes, people even try to boil and eat old pieces of leather to soften them. Spending a winter at medieval tables requires a battle of stomach and will that cannot be imagined by today's standards. Now take a deep breath. You are in the 9th month of your pregnancy, and your labor pains start in the harshest, most ruthless days of the winter season. Although those thick stone walls around you seem to protect you, this moment is actually the most dangerous moment of your life. Giving birth as a noble woman in the Middle Ages means dancing on a thin line between death and life, and winter months increase this risk tenfold. Statistics whisper a terrible truth. 1 in every 5 women loses her life during or after childbirth. Although being noble provides you with some advantages, the dangers brought by winter reset all your status. The biggest enemy of winter is the cold, and stone walls feed this enemy. Your room is freezing despite the fireplace. Braziers and torches lit to increase the temperature of the birth room consume the oxygen inside, and it becomes difficult to breathe due to the throat-burning smoke. Cold air slows down blood circulation and weakens your body's natural defense mechanisms. The risk of infection reaches its peak in winter months. Let alone finding clean water, even existing water freezes. While midwives try to find warm water to wash their hands, they often have to settle for that ice-cold, dirty water. In this period, where hygiene conditions are already primitive, cleanliness becomes impossible in winter. Even the birthing position is torture. As a noble woman, you usually give birth standing up or kneeling, because giving birth lying down is considered a sign of humility. As your bare feet step on that ice-cold stone floor, you experience the risk of frostbite, and your muscles contract from the cold. This prolongs the birth process and increases the danger. Nutritional deficiency also weakens your body. There are no fresh fruits and vegetables, your vitamin stores are empty. While iron deficiency leaves you weak, calcium deficiency makes your bones ache. The level of medical knowledge is frighteningly primitive. Midwives base their experiences only on oral tradition and often on superstitions. When a complication arises, the chance of intervention is almost non-existent. Caesarean section? This is a last and bloody procedure performed to save the baby only in cases where the mother dies. Reaching a physician in winter is also impossible. Snow and storms close the roads. Calling a doctor goes no further than a dream. Your only support is the midwife's experience and luck. Herbal medicines used as painkillers like poppy and lemon balm remain ineffective because they are not found fresh in winter. You have to face those terrible pains with naked courage, often having to resist until you lose consciousness from pain. Bleeding control is a complete nightmare. It is hard to find clean cloths. Existing cloths are moldy in the damp and cold environment. Traditional blood-stopping methods do not work. The situation is even more dramatic for the baby. That tiny newborn body is completely vulnerable to hypothermia. The coldness of the room makes it impossible for the baby to maintain body temperature. Infant mortality rates double or triple in winter. Breast milk can stop due to stress and malnutrition. In this world where there are no alternative foods, remaining without milk means a silent farewell for the baby. There is also a mental collapse. That closed, gloomy weather of winter triggers postpartum depression. Since your mother and sisters cannot come to help because the roads are closed, you are left alone with loneliness and hopelessness in that cold room. And the bitterest truth, the memories of women who die in childbirth are quickly erased. Because of high mortality rates, society has normalized these losses and accepted death as an ordinary part of destiny. A sudden rising fever in your body, a severe cough tearing your lungs apart, and an unbearable headache. In the modern world, going to a doctor and getting a prescription is only as close as a phone call. But when the reality of being in a medieval castle hits your face, a heavy despair settles on you. The nearest physician is days away. Winter conditions have closed the roads, the storm is forcing the doors, and you are nose to nose with death. Exactly at this point, those strange, sometimes effective but often dangerous treatment methods developed by castle residents for centuries come into play. When illness breaks out, the first intervention always comes from the same people: old women. These experienced ladies are the castle's first and only hope, with folk medicine knowledge passed down from generation to generation. They challenge the angel of death with herbal mixtures, strange medicines produced at home, and superstitious rituals. Fever-reducing methods are particularly creative. Ice-cold compresses are applied to your body, or even snow brought from outside is rubbed on your bare skin. Although this shock effect sometimes lowers the fever, it often drags your weakened body into hypothermia. Alternatively, cloths soaked in sharp vinegar are placed on your forehead, and sliced onions are tied to your feet. Cough treatment is a complete trial and error process. Those throat-burning, terribly sweet mixtures consisting of honey, garlic, and onions are prepared and forced down your throat. Honey onion juice, mint tea, and even, it is hard to believe, but boiled worm juices are poured down your throat as a strong cough syrup. One of the most interesting methods is hot animal butter smeared on your chest and wool covered over it. The aim is to make you sweat and throw out the disease. When we move on to wound treatment, things get even stranger. Imagine you have an open wound. Sticky honey is smeared on it, and it is bound tightly with a clean cloth. Since honey really has antibacterial properties, this method sometimes works, so you are lucky. But not everyone is this lucky. A wilder alternative might be waiting for you: pouring fresh animal urine on your wound. Because in that era, it is believed that the burning acid of urine sterilizes the wound. You can guess how much it hurts. Solutions developed for abdominal pains are quite various, but equally disturbing. Hot stones just taken from the stove are placed on your belly, or you are tried to be warmed with pillows filled with cherry pits. Sometimes healers who believe the cure is movement turn you upside down and shake you to perform an abdominal massage. The room fills with the smells of chamomile, fennel, and sage. These herbal teas are forced down your throat to soothe your stomach. If the pain is at an unbearable level, a small amount of alcohol is given to try to numb your pain. In headache crises, the most common method is temple massage. A cloth is tied tightly around your head and ice-cold vinegar compresses are applied to your forehead. But if the pain does not pass, that terrible solution is put on the table: bloodletting. Usually a barber is called and blood is taken from your head to reduce pressure. This procedure often nails you to the bed even more, with dizziness instead of relieving you. Broken bone treatment is literally like a horror movie scene. While trying to set the broken bone back in place, a hard wooden stick is stuffed into your mouth so you don't bite your tongue from the pain. While your screams echo on the stone walls, wooden splints are tied over the bone, and your limbs are fixed tightly so you don't move. Painkiller. The only option is high alcohol drinks. They make you drink until you faint and hope you don't feel the pain. In the treatment of the common cold and flu, which are indispensable in winter, there is only one king: garlic. As if swallowing raw garlic isn't enough, pieces of garlic are inserted into your nostrils, and intense garlic steam is made to be inhaled. Besides this, hot wine, spicy soups, and sweat-inducing herbal mixtures are forced on you. You are wrapped in layers of wool covers and imprisoned in that bed until you are soaked in sweat. Methods against skin diseases are of the kind that will strain your stomach. Vinegar is smeared on your itchy, bruised skin, and salt is sprinkled on it. Think of that burning sensation. On deeper wounds, moldy pieces of bread are pressed with the hope of an antibiotic effect. In cases like psoriasis, sharp-smelling mixtures consisting of animal urine and sweat are smeared on your body. In eye diseases, the most common treatment is, hard to believe, saliva. Especially in the morning, on an empty stomach, someone else's saliva is dripped into your eye to fight infection. Methods like honey water, rubbing a silver coin on the eye, and even dripping raw egg white are tried against eye inflammation. You have to endure these strange treatments with your blurry eyes. In nausea and vomiting crises, mint tea comes to the rescue, and hot compresses are applied to the belly. In severe vomiting, gravity is defied. Your feet are lifted up and your head is held down. It is believed that this position settles the stomach. Approaches to sleep disorders are relatively softer. Lavender, chamomile, and lemon balm are burned inside the room. The smoke of these calming herbs fills your lungs. Herbal teas and light alcohol are given so you can fall asleep, and you are expected to relax. However, in the most desperate situations, medicine leaves its place to religion. Prayers start to be read at your bedside, holy relics are placed on you, and a priest is called to perform the last rites. These rituals provide you with acceptance and psychological support rather than a medical cure, and of course, bloodletting, that universal cure tried for almost every disease. It is believed that your body will be purified from evil spirits and dirty blood by taking blood from the arm, neck, or groin. Whereas this procedure serves no purpose other than weakening your body, which is already fighting the disease and delaying your recovery. Still, everything is not this dark. Healing herbs grown in castle gardens are the safest harbour of winter. Dried sage, mint, chamomile, linden, and echinacea smells whisper the healing of nature to you in these cold stone rooms. Shelter is sought in the power of chicken broth and the healing of bone broth. Valuable foods like fish oil and royal jelly are used as medicine, but at the end of the list stands the most dangerous, most ruthless method, cauterization. If you have an infected wound or bleeding that won't stop, that area is burned with a red-hot piece of iron. That sizzling sound and the smell of burning are the clearest proof of how cruel medieval medicine can be. Iron rods are warmed in the flames to treat chronic aches and pushed against the sore spot. This technique, which appears savage, sometimes truly soothes the agony. Battling illness in medieval fortresses during times without physicians continues with primitive yet inventive methods by today's standards. Although these forms of therapy sometimes yield miraculous results, they frequently intensify the sufferer's pain. As you wander solo within the fortress at the third hour of the night, your steps reverberate through the stone hallways. The flickering candlelight in your grasp generates shadows dancing upon the walls, and you get the sensation that the unknown awaits you at every turn. Serving as a night sentry in the Middle Ages is a battle for survival balanced between life and death, straining the boundaries of bravery and stamina. The night guards, who constitute the backbone of castle security, are not ordinary residents who slumber during the day. These men are a specific class, struggling against the dread and uncertainty brought by the gloom. Guards operating on a rotation system are required to patrol the stronghold throughout the night, examine suspicious noises, and identify potential perils beforehand. Being chosen for the profession of a watchman is not simple. Individuals who will assume this task need to be physically robust, mentally stable, and of a character that can handle terror. Because events occurring in the castle during nocturnal hours push the limits that a normal human can withstand. The primary adversary is the dark. Corners where the glow of candles and torches cannot reach become utterly unknown zones. Sentries must be constantly on the alert while moving in these obscure areas. Enemy agents, burglars, or worse, assassins concealing themselves among the shadows can strike at any instant. The most terrifying aspect of the night shift is the quietude. After the chaos of the day, the absolute silence of the night magnifies even the slightest sounds. Even the scampering of a mouse, the wind striking a window shutter, or the creaking of ancient timber is sufficient to alarm the guard. Patrolling the dungeon area is one of the most arduous tasks. Dark cells where captives are located are filled with the scent of decay and cries of hopelessness. While wandering this section, watchmen must thwart prisoners' escape attempts and simultaneously ensure their own safety. Some inmates try to ensnare the guards and utilize every sort of trick to win their liberty. Treading on tower steps requires a separate struggle. Ascending narrow and steep stairs with heavy armor and weaponry is a tough sport. Moreover, the risk of slipping on these steps is very high. The probability of survival for a falling sentry is at a minimal level. Weather conditions are the guards' greatest test. Roaming on rampart walls on nights with snowstorms means keeping watch under the threat of freezing. Violent wind extinguishes torches, and watchmen are forced to remain in total darkness. In these circumstances, protecting both themselves and the fortress becomes nearly impossible. Solitude throughout the night creates immense pressure psychologically. Guards, who remain alone with only their own thoughts without speaking to anyone for hours, can start perceiving hallucinations over time. These conditions, emerging with the combination of exhaustion and stress, make it difficult for sentries to perform their duties. The most dangerous moments are the times when suspicious noises need to be investigated. When a strange sound is heard, the watchman must go to that zone alone. During this inquiry, the risk of encountering enemy troops, thieves, or intruders is very high. Guards must be both courageous and extremely cautious in these instances. The responsibility of sounding the alarm also generates huge stress. Warning the castle in a moment of real danger is the sentry's most critical task. But raising a false alarm requires serious punishment. In this case, watchmen constantly remain under the pressure of decision-making. The winter guard has to struggle against hypothermia. Since thick garments restrict movement capability, sentries try to maintain their agility while fighting the cold at the same time. Handling weapons with frozen fingers and walking on ice-covered stairs require great mastery. One of the most horrific experiences among watchmen is witnessing death cases. Castle residents dying from sickness, those injured as a result of mishaps or suspicious deaths, are traumatic situations that guards have to cope with throughout the night. Also, night sentries become witnesses to the secret affairs of castle inhabitants. Forbidden love relationships, clandestine meetings, intrigues, and conspiracies do not escape their eyes. These situations leave watchmen in a difficult position, making them unable to know whose side to take. The nutrition issue is also a major trouble. It is impossible to eat regular meals during the night watch. Guards are forced to stay hungry apart from the meager amount of food they carry with them. This situation diminishes concentration and slows down reaction time. Sentries whose sleep patterns are completely disrupted cannot get quality sleep during daylight hours. The noise inside the fortress, the rush of daily life, and the pressure to stay awake constantly wear down the guards physically. One of the greatest fears is the possibility of encountering supernatural events. Since the superstitions of the medieval person are very strong, watchmen think they might confront spirits, ghosts, or demonic entities during night hours. These dreads create more stress than real dangers. Another difficulty guards face is weapon maintenance. Damp air and cold cause arms to rust. The situation of a sentry who realizes his weapon is not functioning at critical moments becomes extremely dangerous. Working as a night watchman in medieval castles is full of hardships that today's security personnel cannot even imagine. The struggle these brave men give for castle safety at night transforms them into true heroes. Murmurs are audible among the wind sounds, leaking through thick stone walls on a cold winter night. These are not just noises made by the gale. They are whispers of forbidden loves, secret rendezvous, and dangerous betrayals. The winter season in medieval castles is not only a time to battle with cold, but also a period where passions born of confinement, prohibitions, and dramatic love stories peak. The closed existence brought by living in the castle in winter intensifies the emotional ties between people. Individuals stuck between the same walls for months start to perceive and feel details they would not notice in normal times. Romances born in this atmosphere become both more intense and more perilous. Illicit affairs within the aristocracy generate the most risky scenarios. When a secret relationship a married lord lives with a young dame is revealed, it can turn into not only a moral scandal, but also a political crisis. Especially among noble families connected by political marriages, such situations can ruin alliances and even lead to wars. The emotional conflicts ladies experience are particularly pathetic. These women, married to men they do not adore for political reasons, can seek true affection elsewhere. Platonic loves felt for young knights, handsome musicians, or even men from the lower class sometimes transform into physical relationships, and scandals erupt. Although romantic relationships among the servant class seem freer, they harbor their own unique risks. Relationships between staff of different statuses can disrupt the castle hierarchy and upset the working order. Especially relationships experienced by high-level servants with those at lower levels are not welcomed. The most dangerous situation is relationships that cross class boundaries. When a secret love a noble lady lives with an ordinary soldier, or the lord's daughter lives with a butler is discovered, it can produce terrible results. The man from the lower class is either slain or sent into exile. The woman can be completely excluded from her family. Organizing secret dates in the long nights of winter becomes both easy and arduous. Since darkness falls early, it becomes easier to move secretly, but cold air makes open-area meetings almost impossible. Lovers are compelled to meet in indoor spaces to keep warm. This increases the risk of getting caught. Secret notes are the most common form of expression of love in winter months. The elite class who can read and write convey their feelings through letters. These missives are usually carried through trusted servants and kept in great secrecy. But a note ending up in the wrong hands can turn the lives of the related people upside down. The ways betrayals are unveiled are quite various. Sometimes rivals acting out of jealousy would report them, and sometimes situations witnessed by chance were exposed. The most painful discoveries happened in moments when spouses witnessed it with their own eyes. Religious authorities took a very strict stance against these situations. Canon law met the crime of adultery with heavy penalties, specifically targeting women. Due to these relationships deemed sinful, women could be shut away in convents, and men could be sent into exile. The gossip network inside the castle played a huge role in the spread of love and betrayal stories. Rumors spreading among servant women would reach the entire castle in a short time, and even untrue stories could create great dramas. Children were the most innocent victims of these situations. Children born from forbidden relationships were ostracized by society and forced to carry the stamp of illegitimacy. The future of these children was generally uncertain. Increased alcohol consumption during the winter months also caused an increase in illicit relationships. Wrong decisions made in a state of drunkenness were met with great regret the next morning, but it was already too late. Jealousy dramas, which included violence, occurred more frequently in the winter months. Cheated spouses chased after revenge, issued challenges for duels, and sometimes fatal fights broke out. The most interesting situation created by the confinement of winter was unexpected intimacies. People who would never speak in normal times started chatting during the long winter nights. These chats could turn into intimacy over time. Music and poetry were the fundamental tools by which love was expressed. Secret lovers composed songs and wrote poems for each other. These artistic works sometimes contained indirect confessions, carrying messages for those who understood. Separations experienced at the end of winter were particularly dramatic. When spring came, castle life would return to normal. The intimacies experienced throughout the winter would end. These temporary relationships sometimes turned into permanent pain, creating long-lasting melodramas. The most romantic stories happened in situations where true love overcame obstacles. The stories of couples who managed to overcome class differences, family pressures, and social barriers turned into legends passed down from generation to generation. Love and betrayal stories experienced in medieval castles during winter months were striking examples showing how humanity's most universal emotions took shape under difficult conditions. These stories harbored the most intense states of both tragedy and romance. You are a 7-year-old child, and you have to step onto the icy stone floor with bare feet at 5 in the morning. Your tears freeze on your cheek from the cold, but crying is forbidden, because a crying child can never be a lord. In medieval castle life, the education of noble children was a system severe enough to give modern parents nightmares, cruel and disregarding the childhood period. In winter months, this education became even more savage. Small bodies had to struggle with both the cold and harsh discipline. The education of noble male children began at age 4. The first thing expected from a child at this age was to develop resistance to physical pain. Practices like washing with cold water in the early morning hours, walking barefoot on the stone floor, and spending time outside without thick clothes were part of the daily routine. The aim was to harden the child's body and prepare them for future wars. On winter mornings, 6-year-old children were forced to do gymnastics in the freezing courtyard. Exercises like running, sit-ups and push-ups were done in freezing cold, the children's breath steaming. Children who fainted or cried during these workouts were punished and subjected to harder exercises. War training started at age 3 with wooden swords. These weapons, which were heavy for small hands, were intentionally made heavy to accelerate the children's muscle development. Doing sword practice under the snow in winter months required both physical and mental endurance. Most children trying to hold weapons with frozen fingers cried from the pain. Discipline training was perhaps the most ruthless part. Physical punishment was widely used to teach children to obey. Punishments like beating, starvation, and solitary confinement in cold rooms were considered normal. Waiting out a punishment in unheated rooms, especially in winter months, was like torture for children. There were also strict rules regarding nutrition. Sometimes spoiled food was given to noble children to harden their palates, or they were left to starve. When food shortages occurred in winter months, children were exposed to the same difficult conditions as adults. Learning to endure hunger was considered a condition for survival in wartime. Literacy education could also turn into torture. Children who did not learn Latin were punished with beatings and forced to repeat the same texts for hours. Studying by candlelight in the darkness of winter nights tired the eyes and caused headaches. Horse riding training was particularly dangerous. 5-year-old children were put on huge horses and left to struggle, not to fall. Riding on icy ground in winter months was a skill difficult even for experienced warriors. Children falling and getting injured was met as ordinary. Social hierarchy education also started at very early ages. Children were taught before whom to bow, with whom to speak, and of whom to be wary. Children who violated these rules were sternly warned, and sometimes people from lower classes were punished in front of their eyes to teach a lesson. Religious education also passed harshly. Children forced to stand motionless during long rites could not move even if their knees ached. Kneeling for hours on cold church stones in winter months could be unbearable for small bodies. The solitude test was one of the most ruthless practices. Children were left alone in dark rooms at night and expected to face their fears alone. The length of winter nights made this test even harder. Children had to struggle with fear for hours. For the pain endurance test, small injuries were intentionally inflicted on the children. The child's reaction to pain was measured with practices like needle pricking, making small cuts, and creating burns. Children who cried from pain were considered unsuccessful and subjected to the test again. During hunting training, children were forced to kill animals. They were expected to kill a living being for the first time so that they would not hesitate when killing their enemies in the future. This affected children deeply emotionally. Some experienced trauma. The education of girls was different, but just as ruthless. They were also expected to learn skills like household management and embroidery perfectly at an early age. Girls who made mistakes were subjected to physical punishment. Perfection standards were kept very high. Marriage preparation also started very early. 10-year-old girls were taught how to obey their future husbands and how to manage the house. During this education, their personalities were suppressed and their independent thinking abilities were blunted. Health education also passed harshly. Children practiced on real cases to learn how to fight disease and intervene in injuries. They were expected to get used to seeing blood and not be disturbed by witnessing pain. One of the most pathetic situations was siblings being forced to compete against each other. To be strong regarding inheritance, siblings were turned into rivals. The bonds of love between them were intentionally weakened. Even playing games was part of the education. Children's games were organized as war simulations. Even entertainment was made competitive. Losing children were punished, winners were rewarded. The education received by child lords in medieval winter castles was a system based on bullying, completely far from today's understanding of children's rights. Although most children passing through this education experienced trauma, it was believed that such a harsh preparation was necessary to survive due to the conditions of the period. Your door is knocked on, and the Lord's tax collectors appear on the threshold. While a snowstorm blows outside, they eye the last sack of wheat your family set aside for winter. While your children cry from hunger, every grain of grain you give will go to the table of the nobles in the castle, and you will try to balance between life and death once again. Being a peasant in the Middle Ages meant struggling for your own survival while simultaneously financing your master's luxurious life. The tax collection system was one of the biggest sources of nightmares in the peasants' lives. Lords demanded more taxes from peasants in winter months to cover the costs of castle life. A large part of the resources needed for heating materials, food stocks, and castle maintenance came off the backs of the peasants. The most ruthless tax type was the harvest tax. Peasants had to give half, sometimes more, of their produce to the lord. This rate could increase even more in winter months because the needs of the castle residents increased. Peasants had to hand over the majority of their produce, knowing their own families would go hungry throughout the winter. The arrival of tax collectors to the village meant sheer terror. These men were usually armed and ruthless. They beat peasants who couldn't pay, looted their homes, and harmed women and children. When peasants saw these men, they tried to flee, but escape opportunities were very limited. When cash could not be found, peasants had to give their belongings. Farm animals, agricultural tools, household items, even clothes could be taken as tax. The situation was even more tragic for peasants who lost their animals in the winter months, because these animals were sources of both milk and meat. One of the most terrible situations was the child tax. Lords sometimes asked for children from peasant families, taking them as castle servants. This practice was technically considered a tax, but was actually no different from a slavery system. families were at risk of never seeing their children again. Tax collection became even more cruel in winter months. Cold weather conditions broke the peasants' resistance, and the risk of the sick and elderly dying increased. But tax collectors did not care about this. They insisted on taking the determined amounts. The woman tax was particularly shameful. Bachelor tax was taken from unmarried young women, and fertility tax was demanded from married women. When these taxes could not be paid, women were subjected to physical violence and sometimes raped. Peasants' attempts to evade tax were very risky games. Peasants trying to hide their produce faced very heavy penalties when caught. Beating, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and even the death penalty could be given. The most despotic lords increased tax amounts arbitrarily. Additional tax is demanded from peasants for reasons like castle construction, war preparation, wedding ceremony. These requests could not be refused. Peasants were getting under additional burden for every whim of their lords. A borrowing system had developed among peasants to pay tax. Families unable to make payment take loans from their neighbors, but paying back these debts was becoming impossible most of the time. Families entering into a debt spiral eventually lose their properties, were becoming completely poor. Harassments done to peasant women during tax collection were common. Tax collectors abuse women by misusing their power, silencing men who oppose this situation with the threat of killing. Peasant women were being exposed to both economic and sexual exploitation. Even when deaths increased due to disease and hunger, tax collection does not stop. Families of the deceased take over tax debts as inheritance. Therefore, even death was not bringing salvation. Children were having to pay their parents' tax debts. Resistance attempts of peasants were very rare and very dangerous. Tax riots are suppressed harshly. Rebels were being executed. Since peasants' opportunities to organize are limited, mass resistance was almost impossible. One of the most insidious tax types was road tax. Peasants had to pay tax even while moving on their own lands. Going to the market, visiting a relative, going to get water were being taxed. Peasants unable to pay tax in winter months sometimes had to break up their families. Children are given to different families. Family unity would be broken. This situation would collapse the peasants psychologically, destroy their hopes. Tax collectors were searching homes thoroughly to find hidden wealth of peasants. In these searches, household items are broken, women's valuable items are stolen, the family's privacy was mocked. One of the most tragic situations was emerging when peasants needed to sell their own children to be able to pay tax. Children sold to slave traders could not return to their families again. This pain lasted for a lifetime. It was met as normal for peasants wanting to evade tax to be exposed to torture. Peasants were being forced to say where their money is, with methods like water torture, beating, burning. There were also those dying during these tortures. The tax burden of peasants was so heavy that most of the time 80% of what they produced was being taken as tax. The remaining amount was not sufficient to feed the family, and peasants were constantly living on the starvation line. The tax cruelty experienced by medieval peasants was in dimensions far exceeding today's understanding of justice. The suffering these people pulled remained as bitter memories, showing how valuable the concept of social justice is. Whispers are heard among the sounds of the fire crackling. This meeting, which looks like a sincere chat of nobles gathered around the fireplace in the castle's great hall, is actually a deadly council where plots where blood will be spilled are established. Betrayal plans, hidden in faces where the flame-light dances, determine which lord will die tomorrow, which throne will change. The length of winter nights was becoming the perfect decor for these dark games. In medieval castle life, the fireplace was not just a place for warming up. This was a sacred area where political power melted, alliances were established and broken, death orders were given. Words spoken under the hypnotic effect of the fire could determine the fate of empires. The most ideal time to set a plot was winter evenings. Long nights, cold weather, and closed living conditions were creating a perfect opportunity for secret meetings. In these periods when connection with the outer world was cut, schemers can move comfortably, could develop their plans without making anyone notice. Political circles established around the fireplace possessed a strict hierarchy. The strongest lord sits in the seat closest to the fire. Others were taking distance according to their power. This seating arrangement carries a political message, was showing who is allied with whom. The masters of assassination plans were the old lords. These men, who gained experience for years, had developed extremely subtle methods to eliminate their enemies. Poison, murder made to look like an accident, secret stabbing, and even deaths resembling suicide via psychological pressure were being planned. The most dangerous conversations were being held while sitting opposite in the dining hall. Shadows created by the flame light hide facial expressions and were making it difficult to understand the speaker's true intentions. This shadow play works in favor of schemers and was providing secrecy. Female schemers were especially dangerous. Noble ladies, using this power that men underestimated in their own favor, were surprising their enemies. Women appearing to do embroidery by the fireplace were actually setting plans where blood will be spilled. Fireplace meetings played a huge role in the art of alliance building. Two lords who are enemies could get close in the warmth of the fire and could cooperate for their mutual interests, but these alliances usually become temporary. They were betraying each other when they found the first opportunity. Poison was the most common assassination method. Poison could be mixed into wine drunk, food eaten, or even air breathed by the fireplace. Toxic substances are generally obtained from natural-looking plant extracts, and it was very difficult to be discovered. Spies were an indispensable part of fireplace meetings. Agents disguised as servants listened to chats and were transferring important information to their masters. Sometimes more than one spy is present in the same meeting, serving without recognizing each other. The most dangerous plans were the long-term ones. It was necessary to follow an enemy for years, learn their habits, and wait for their weakest moment. These long-term plans established by the fireplace were being conducted with patience and cold-bloodedness. Letter games were also a common intrigue method. Fake letters are prepared. Enemies would be pitted against each other. These letters are generally destroyed by burning in the fireplace fire. Evidence was not left. Religious authorities were also part of these political games. Priests and bishops, speaking in the name of God, influence political decisions. Sometimes were even giving assassination orders. Murders committed under the guise of religious commandment were among the most cunning plans. Promises given by the fireplace were sacred, but at the same time very dangerous. The person taking an oath believed they would receive both worldly and otherworldly punishment if they did not keep their word. Therefore, promises given are generally kept but could be swindled very skillfully. The most frightening situation was emerging when there were intra-family intrigues. Brother killing brother, son poisoning his father, or wife having her husband killed were among the bitterest plans. Family ties carried no meaning in front of political interests. Even children were being included in this intrigue world. At a young age, princes and princesses were being used to gather information about their parents' enemies. Since they looked innocent, no one was suspecting them. Hand signals made in the flame light were forming a secret language. Conspirators agree silently with these signs, were transferring information about their plans. This secret language was so developed that even long conversations could be done with signs. Fireplace fire was at the same time a tool for evidence tampering. Crime evidence, letters, documents, and other traces were being destroyed by burning in the fire. The heat of the fire was completely eliminating even the slightest clues. Music and poetry were also being used as intrigue tools. Messages hidden between song lyrics were becoming threats or warnings to rival lords. Especially musicians playing instruments played a huge role in this secret communication. Friendships established by the fireplace were the most dangerous ones. During conversations that seem sincere, enemies get close, learn each other's secrets. Later, they were using this information as a weapon. The most skillful assassinations were the ones made to look like accidents, deaths appearing natural, like falling from stairs. Horse accident, injury in hunting, or death in fire were actually carefully planned murders. In medieval castles, the fireplace side was functioning as the center of political games and deadly intrigues. The heat of the fire was warming not just bodies, but at the same time, the darkest plans too. When you get into bed to manage the night, even the air you breathe out evaporates, and your sheets are ice cold. Your bedroom, stuck between thick stone walls, while it needs to be a shelter that will escape the cold of the outer world, has actually turned into a trap carrying the risk of freezing. In the Middle Ages, being able to survive through a night was a survival game requiring bedroom war tactics, creativity, and patience. Bedroom arrangement was the first front of the war with cold. Thick fabrics, leathers, and woolen covers were laid layer by layer. However, these materials generally absorb moisture, were starting to mold over time. Damp covers absorb the body's heat and paradoxically could cause more coldness. Beds were generally built high from the ground because cold air was settling to the bottom. High bed frames were allowing the opportunity to place heat sources underneath. Some rich families put coal braziers under the bed or even hid hot brick pieces. While these methods are effective, they were also carrying high fire risk. The most common heating technique was the hot stone practice. Stones heated in the fireplace are wrapped in thick cloths, placed at the foot of the bed. These stones give heat for hours, were ensuring the feet warm up. However, very hot stones can create burn risk. Very cold ones were not working. Bed sharing was one of the most practical solutions. Spouses, children, even trusted servants sharing the same bed were combining their body heats. This practice was not just for heating, but at the same time for security. Being alone in the length of winter nights was challenging in terms of both physical and spiritual aspects. To protect breath heat, various techniques had been developed. Pulling the cover in a way to close the face was creating a natural warming by ensuring the breath stays under. However, this method can lead to oxygen deficiency, sometimes could birth a suffocation risk. Clothing strategies were quite complex. Wearing very thick clothes limited mobility and caused sweating. When sweating stopped, the body lost more heat. The ideal solution was dressing in thin layers, but this luxury was not available for every castle resident. Pre-bed exercises were an effective way to increase body heat. Simple gymnastic movements, stretching exercises, and walking fast accelerate blood circulation. It allowed getting into bed warmer. However, excessive exercise produces sweat. This could have a reverse effect. Hot drinks were an important part of the pre-night ritual. Spiced wine, hot milk, herbal teas increased body temperature from the inside. Usually warming spices like honey, cinnamon, clove were added. Their effects were tried to be strengthened. Arranging the bedding tool also required art. Thin covers were placed at the bottom, thick and heavy covers at the top. This layering system allows the formation of air pockets, increasing the insulation effect. The edges of the covers were tightly closed, preventing cold air from entering. Bedroom ventilation required a fine balance. A completely closed room creates stuffiness, causes headache. Too much ventilation would let the heat escape. Minimal ventilation was tried to be provided by leaving small air holes. Fighting winter depression was also an important factor affecting sleep quality. Long, dark nights spoil the mood, leading to sleep disorders. Activities like reading by candlelight, listening to music, and chatting helped keep morale high. Special precautions were taken for children. Since the heat loss rates of young children are higher than adults, extra protection was needed. Children were generally made to sleep between parents, ensuring they benefit maximum from body heats. The situation was even more critical for elderly castle residents. Old age slows down blood circulation, reducing resistance to cold. Special heating methods are applied for these people. They were kept under constant control. Sleep strategies changed completely when sick. While keeping cool might be necessary for patients with fever, extra warming precautions were taken for patients with chills. In case of illness, sleep was considered an important part of the treatment. Security concerns also affected sleep patterns. Closing doors and windows securely and keeping weapons within accessible distance were part of the preparation against midnight attacks. Dreams and nightmares were experienced more frequently on cold nights. Physical discomfort could turn into mental disturbance. Fearful dreams were seen. These situations lower sleep quality, preventing rest. Morning awakening rituals were also part of the war with ice. Getting out of bed requires great courage. The body was suddenly exposed to cold air. Dressing quickly, warming up, and starting the daily routine were conditions for survival. Nights spent in medieval castle bedrooms were full of struggle stories showing how valuable today's comfort standards are. Being able to sleep in these difficult conditions was a real success. When you go down to the castle kitchen, the scene you face is not promising. Diminishing supplies on storage shelves, frozen waters, and extinguished ovens await you. The responsibility of feeding the castle residents is on your shoulders, but the materials left in your hand decrease day by day, and their quality deteriorates. Working in a medieval castle kitchen was a survival art requiring being a magician, creating miracles, and constantly coming face to face with death. The castle kitchen was one of the toughest working areas in winter. Thick stone walls keep the cold inside. The humidity rate was becoming very high. Cooks had to work in a constantly wet and cold environment. The risk of freezing in hands, the danger of catching disease, and constant physical fatigue were integral parts of kitchen life. Fire control was the heart of the kitchen, but at the same time the biggest threat. Oven fires that need to burn constantly were being controlled very carefully due to the necessity of saving wood. If the fire goes out, lighting it again could take hours. If you burn it too strong, valuable wood was being wasted. Being able to establish this balance required years of experience. Provision management was one of the cook's greatest skills. Food stocks prepared at the beginning of winter had to be distributed carefully until the end of winter. How much spending will be made every day is calculated. Remaining amounts were constantly controlled. Making a wrong calculation meant hunger at the end of winter. The water problem was one of the kitchen's most critical issues. Frozen wells, broken water systems, and dirty water sources were leaving cooks helpless. Sometimes it was necessary to struggle for hours to find clean water. Carrying water was a separate torture, because heavy containers were being tried to be carried on frozen ground. The art of saving spoiled food was the secret of the cooking profession. Scraping the moldy parts of moldy bread, separating the solid parts of vegetables starting to rot, trying to make cheese from soured milk were parts of the daily routine. Nothing was thrown away. because every piece was valuable. Meat preservation techniques were quite complex. Meats tried to be preserved with methods like salting, drying, smoking were starting to spoil over time. To hide the smell of spoiled meat, intense spices are used, aiming to kill harmful bacteria by boiling for a long time. It had become necessary to develop creative food recipes. Cooks, trying to make different dishes constantly with the same ingredients, were trying to create maximum variety with limited resources. Bone broth soups, vegetable scrap mixtures, and grain-based filling meals were forming the basic menu. Kitchen hierarchy had strict rules. The head cook makes every decision. Assistants applied these decisions literally. Even small mistakes could lead to big punishments. Cooks, wasting provisions, burning food, or violating hygiene rules could be punished with beating. One of the biggest nightmare scenarios was food poisoning cases. Getting sick caused by spoiled food was considered the cook's responsibility. When castle residents got sick, cooks found guilty are punished heavily, sometimes could be killed. Nutritional diversity was approaching zero in winter months. Fresh fruit and vegetables cannot be found. Vitamin deficiency was becoming widespread. Cooks were trying to supplement this problem with dried fruits, pickled vegetables, and herbal teas. Kitchen tools were becoming dysfunctional in the cold. Metal tools become ice cold, sticking when it touches your hand. Wooden tools absorb moisture, crack, and break. Tool maintenance and repair were jobs that needed to be done constantly. Crowded feeding organization required great skill. Correct timing must be done for hundreds of people to eat at the same time. Everyone's stomach had to be filled. Nobles ate first, then servants. Breaking this order could create a big problem. Food hygiene was being tried to be maintained in primitive conditions. It was difficult to find hot water to wash hands. Soap was considered a luxury. Since cleaning materials are limited, the risk of disease transmission was very high. Night shifts were especially difficult. Preparation is made for the next day's meals, bread dough is prepared, and cooking processes were started in the early hours. Working in a dark kitchen, using cutting tools by candlelight, carried great risk. Theft threat existed constantly. Hungry servants would try to steal food from the kitchen. Cooks had the responsibility of protecting provisions. When loss is detected, cooks could be held responsible. Drink production was also the kitchen's responsibility. Wine, beer, and fruit juices are prepared. Their quality was controlled. Producing spoiled drink meant both health risk and loss of prestige. Pressure was increasing even more in guest hosting situations. Special meals must be prepared for incoming guests. Service must be done in a quality to protect castle prestige. Creating a luxury appearance with limited resources required great art. Special nutrition programs were applied in case of illness. Soft foods, healing soups, and strength-giving drinks were prepared for sick castle residents. These special diets are planned separately from normal meals, could require extra resources. Waste management was also an important issue. Food scraps, bones, and garbage were creating both hygiene and security risks. It was necessary to dispose of these wastes safely, to protect from pests and rodents. Working in medieval castle kitchens was a tough profession, requiring creativity, endurance, and constant problem-solving ability. The miracles these cooks achieved were proof of what could be done with limited opportunities. You hear a crackle and wake up. The sound is not coming from the straw pile under your hand. It is the sound of your tears freezing from the cold cracking. The dark dungeon cell surrounding you is located in the depths of castle dungeons, the most savage penal system of the Middle Ages. Every breath you take here is a miracle. Every passing hour is proof of the tough struggle you give between life and death. Surviving in this underground hell in winter is a torturous experience, pushing the limits of human will. Castle dungeons were underground labyrinths designed for the most terrible criminals. These cells, surrounded by thick stone walls, never see daylight. It smelled only of damp, rot, and hopelessness. In winter months, these underground cells were literally turning into freezing traps. Cell conditions were at an inhumane level. Narrow and low-ceilinged cubicles were in dimensions where an adult cannot stand properly. These places, whose floor is covered with mud, filth, and animal feces, were areas where no hygiene rule was valid. In winter months, this filth freezes, forming sharp ices. The sound of dripping water was a characteristic feature of dungeons. Water constantly dripping from the ceiling was falling on the prisoners' heads, on them. This water becomes mixed with ice in winter months, keeping prisoners constantly wet and cold. The rhythm of the dripping sound was driving prisoners crazy over time. The feeding system was a complete torture tool. The meal given once a day usually consisted of rotten bread pieces and muddy water. In winter months, these foods freeze. It was becoming difficult to chew. Most of the time, prisoners had to keep frozen breads in their mouths to melt them. No rights were granted regarding clothing. Prisoners are thrown into prison with the clothes they were caught in. They were wearing nothing extra. These clothes would tear, rot, and become ineffective over time. In winter months, naked body parts were under the risk of freezing. Disease was roaming in the dungeons. Due to cold, dampness, and nutritional deficiency, prisoners were getting sick very quickly. Colds, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and skin diseases were common. No treatment is applied for sick prisoners. They were left to die. Mental collapse was coming faster than physical collapse. Darkness, silence, and loneliness were spoiling the prisoners' minds. Those starting to see hallucinations, talking to themselves, and screaming were common. The length of winter months was accelerating this mental breakdown. The most terrible punishment method was water torture. Prisoners are dipped into dungeon waters, were kept until the drowning point. In winter months, this torture was becoming even more ruthless, because the water was ice cold. Prisoners undergoing body shock were often dying of heart attack. Dungeon guards were also ruthless characters. These men do not like behaving humanely to prisoners, were enjoying torturing. Beating, humiliation, and psychological pressure were parts of their daily routines. They were playing games to pit prisoners against each other. Group cells were even more dangerous. Situations where more than one prisoner is kept in the same cell were leading to conflict and violence. Food fights, space-grabbing conflicts, and the strong crushing the weak were frequently experienced. In winter months, these conflicts were intensifying even more. Death was a daily event in dungeons. Prisoners dying by freezing, dying from disease, or committing suicide were met as ordinary. The corpses of the dead are sometimes left in the cell for days. Other prisoners were forced to live together with rotting corpses. Escape attempts were almost impossible. Thick walls, iron bars, and constant guard control were preventing escape. Prisoners caught in an escape attempt are sentenced to heavier punishments, sometimes were being killed. Communication was completely banned. Prisoners speaking with each other, knocking on cell walls, or making any sound had been banned. Those violating this rule receive mouth-gagging punishment. Their speaking abilities were being taken away. Family visits were not allowed. Prisoners are completely losing their connection with the world, could not get news from their loved ones. This situation accelerates psychological collapse, was breaking the will to live. The most ruthless punishment types were the chaining practice. Heavy chains are attached to prisoners' feet and hands. Their mobility would be completely restricted. These chains become ice cold in winter months. It would create freezing in contact with skin. Light deprivation was blinding the prisoners. People staying in the dark for months were starting to lose their sight abilities. Prisoners seeing sunlight could experience burning and blindness in their eyes. Human dignity was being tried to be completely destroyed. Prisoners had to ask for permission, even for toilet needs. Most of the time, this permission is not given. They were forced to live in their own filth. Hope was being tried to be killed completely. Release dates are not told to prisoners. How long they will stay was left uncertain. This uncertainty was causing them to collapse spiritually. Torture varieties were unlimited. Physical tortures like pricking needles into fingertips, pulling out nails, bone breaking were considered normal. In winter months, these tortures were becoming even more painful. Spending winter in medieval castle dungeons was one of the most terrible experiences in humanity's dark history. Those surviving in these conditions were considered to have lived a real survival miracle. With the first lights of dawn, your thick boots slip on the icy courtyard stones, and every breath coming out from under your heavy armor mixes into the air as white steam. The sword you hold in your hand is ice cold and your fingers are stiff, but training cannot be stopped, because the enemy does not wait for spring. War can break out at any moment. For medieval knights, winter months were not a time for rest, but the toughest training period. And even being able to survive in this harsh preparation process was a victory in itself. Night training would get even harder in winter months. Training under cold weather conditions was simulating real war conditions, because most wars were fought in winter months. Since enemy armies would also have to fight under the same difficult conditions, knights had to be ready for these conditions. Morning trainings were starting before daybreak. Knights get up in the dark, were taking their places in icy courtyards. The first exercise would be running to increase body heat. Although running on icy ground creates a slipping risk, it was developing balance and agility. The armor-wearing process was taking longer in winter months. Cold metal could stick when it contacted the skin. First, thick fabrics are worn, then armor pieces were attached one by one. This process could sometimes take an hour and was requiring great concentration. Sword practice was the toughest part. Being able to stand on icy ground at the same time swinging the heavy sword was requiring great mastery. Holding a sword with frozen fingers was giving pain, but enduring this pain had to be learned, because the same conditions would be present in real war too. Spear training was particularly dangerous. The movement of attacking with a spear on a horse was very risky on icy ground. Both the horse and the rider were under the danger of falling. That's why winter trainings were done more carefully and controlled. Horse riding training was one of the hardest parts of winter. Horses are also affected by the cold, were behaving more nervously. Riding a horse on icy ground was creating great danger for both the horse and the rider. Therefore, special horseshoes and anti-skid precautions were taken. Shield practice was requiring arm strength. Carrying the heavy shield for hours was tiring, but winter trainings were developing this endurance. Although shield movements are harder on icy ground, they were being learned that much more effectively. Group combat trainings were the most fun part. Knights were making fake war with each other in teams. These trainings reflect the real war atmosphere, was developing teamwork. These clashes, made in snow-covered courtyards, were creating a spectacular appearance. Target shooting trainings were requiring precision. Remote attack techniques like arrow shooting, spear throwing, and stone throwing were becoming harder in cold air. Wind, snow, and ice conditions were making calculations difficult. Wrestling trainings were requiring nakedness. Knights were taking off their armor and wrestling in snow-covered courtyards. This both increases body resistance and was developing close combat techniques. When the naked body fell on snow, it was becoming an important endurance test. Endurance tests were the most ruthless part. Knights are forced to stand motionless under snow for hours. Their capacities to endure cold were being tested. Those fainting or giving up in these tests were considered unsuccessful. Weapon maintenance was the neglected part of winter trainings. Cold and dampness were causing weapons to rust. Cleaning, oiling, and protecting weapons after training was a must. This maintenance routine was also part of the education. Tactical lessons were being held indoors. War plans, enemy tactics, and defense strategies were being taught. These lessons provided mental development and increased strategic thinking ability. Injuries were happening more frequently in winter trainings. Falls, fractures, and dislocations were common on icy ground. Learning to cope with these injuries was also part of the training. It was necessary to endure pain and continue fighting while injured. Nutrition was an important part of the training. Since knights consumed intense calories, they needed rich nutrition. Meat, bread, wine, and vitamin-rich foods were consumed. Correct nutrition would increase training efficiency. Rest and recovery were also part of the program. Very intense training could cause muscle tears. Controlled rest, massage, and hot baths were removing muscle fatigue. Morale motivation was very important. The difficulty of winter trainings could spoil the knight's morale. Therefore, morale was tried to be kept high with music, songs, and stories. Competition trainings were increasing motivation. Competitions held among knights were organized to learn who performed better and who was more durable. Winners were rewarded, losers did extra training. Mental preparation was also important. War psychology, fear control, and stress management were being taught. Not panicking in real war and maintaining cold-bloodedness carried vital importance. Team harmony developing activities were being done. Knights lived together, trained together, and knew each other. This close bond could save lives during war. Leadership training was also being given. Knights who would be future commanders were being educated on team management, decision-making, and strategy determination subjects. Although medieval knights' winter trainings are seen as very heavy and dangerous according to today's standards, it was necessary preparation considering the war conditions of that period. Those passing this harsh education were becoming real war machines. The last news from the outside world belonged to 3 weeks ago. Since then, you saw the same faces between thick stone walls. The only view you could look at from the window is a frozen world under white snow cover and a feeling of space narrowing a little more every passing day. Strange voices start to be heard in your mind. Unfamiliar thoughts appear, and distinguishing the line between reality and imagination was becoming difficult. Spending winter in a castle in the Middle Ages was a wearing experience, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually as well. Confined space syndrome was one of the most common spiritual problems of castle life. Living inside the same corridors, rooms, and views for months spoils people's mental balance. The feeling that walls were literally collapsing on them was becoming widespread. This situation was showing itself with symptoms similar to claustrophobia. Social tension was increasing over time. Being together with the same people constantly was making even the smallest habits unbearable. Arguments breaking out in the dining hall, collisions experienced in the corridor, and meaningless fights were becoming an ordinary part of daily life. Immutability depression was one of the most common problems. Repeating the same routines every day, being in the same environment, affects brain chemistry negatively, creating a deep feeling of hopelessness. People start questioning the meaning of life, cannot dream about the future, and were losing their motivations. Sleep disorders were affecting almost everyone. The weakening of the day-night cycle, lack of artificial light, and constant stress were spoiling the sleep pattern. Insomnia was leading to hallucinations, states of irritability, and aggressive behaviors. Communication disorders were also seen frequently. Castle residents chatting with the same people for months were having difficulty understanding each other over time. Deterioration in language, unintelligible mumblings, and social withdrawal were becoming widespread. Paranoia was increasing as winter progressed. People start doubting each other, producing conspiracy theories, and experiencing trust problems. Hoarding food, holding secret meetings, and mutual accusations were seen frequently. Memory problems were also common. Vitamin deficiency, stress, and monotony weaken memory functions. People were becoming unable to remember events experienced in the recent past. This situation was causing identity confusion and distortion in time perception. Obsessive behaviors were emerging in many people. Mirror movements, constantly repeating, counting habits, and meaningless routines were becoming widespread. Although these actions developed to reduce anxiety, they were leading to other problems in the long run. Aggression level was rising significantly. The tendency to violence, especially among young men, increases. Physical fights were becoming frequent. Emotional numbness was emerging as a natural result of long-term stress. People become unable to feel their emotions after a point. Indifference and social disconnection were developing. Religious mysticism was an increasing phenomenon. Hopelessness directs people to extreme religiosity. Mass prayer ceremonies, self-punishment rituals, and mass hysteria cases could be experienced. Children were the group most affected by this process. Their mental developments are affected negatively. Behavioral disorders and emotional instabilities were emerging. Alcohol use was becoming widespread. Excessive alcohol is consumed to cope with depression and anxiety. This gives both physical and spiritual damage in the long run, was increasing aggression. Women, on the other hand, were experiencing extra stress due to gender restrictions, scarcity of freedom of movement, and patriarchal pressures. This was leading to an increase in depression, anxiety, and hysteria cases in women. Leadership weakening was producing dangerous results. Even persons in authority positions could lose their decision-making abilities under spiritual pressure. This situation was creating risk for all castle people. Self-harm events were increasing. Persons falling into hopelessness were harming themselves with methods like cutting and burning. Mass madness was a rare but real phenomenon. Sometimes a group of people could exhibit irrational behaviors at the same time. Mass hysteria could be experienced. Distortion of time perception was common due to the monotonous environment and lack of external stimuli. People cannot perceive the passage of time correctly. This was increasing anxiety. Identity confusion was emerging due to long-term isolation and restricted roles. Persons were starting to question who they are and their purposes. The recovery process was not easy even when winter ended. Spiritual damage does not heal spontaneously when spring comes. Many people carry scars that will last a lifetime, were needing long-term therapy. As coping methods, music, storytelling, games, and social activities were being organized. Although these were not always successful, they were providing a bit of relief. The psychological effects of winter isolation in medieval castles were truly devastating when evaluated in the light of modern psychology. These experiences offer important lessons to today's mental health understanding. While the trembling candle flame dances on book pages, your eyes try to pick out the letters, and you hold on to one of the rare ways to pass time in the long winter night. The small crowd gathered around you listens to every word you read, holding their breath. because knowing reading and writing was a talent as rare as wizardry in that period. Winter nights in medieval castles were remembered as magical times where education and entertainment intertwined, knowledge was considered sacred, and stories came to life. Literacy ability was a very rare skill found in the Middle Ages. Since the vast majority of castle residents did not know how to read and write, persons who were literate were very valuable. These persons generally emerged from among clergy, nobles, or specially educated servants. Crowds would gather around persons possessing this rare talent on winter nights. Doing reading by candlelight required great mastery. Trembling creates moving shadows, would make it difficult to pick out letters. The reader had to both hold the book at the correct distance and constantly adjust the candle's position. Long reading sessions were causing eye fatigue and headache. Books were extremely valuable items in that period. Each book was a handwritten, bound, and carefully protected treasure. The value of a book was sometimes as much as a house. Therefore, books are treated very carefully. Care was taken not to damage them. Religious books were the most common reading material. The Bible, prayer books, and life stories of saints were the most read works on winter nights. These readings carried both educational and morale-giving quality. Listeners find consolation in these stories, gained spiritual strength. Historical chronicles were also among beloved reading materials. Adventures of old kings, war stories, and heroic epics fascinated the listeners. These stories were providing both information and entertainment. Especially young men were very influenced by these heroic stories. Poetry readings were a special art branch. Lyrical poems, love stories, and epic works were read with a special intonation. A good poetry reader could drown listeners in tears or bring them to laughter. These performances were like real theatre shows. Philosophy and science books appealed to elite tastes. Aristotle's works, math books, and writings on natural sciences could only be understood by the educated section. These readings start intellectual discussions, provided exchange of ideas. Reading sessions were becoming a social activity. People from different ages come together, gathered around stories. Elders share their experiences, young people ask questions, children dreamed. These meetings strengthened intergenerational communication. The memorization tradition was also very strong. Persons not knowing reading and writing memorized stories they heard, transferred them to others. Thanks to this oral tradition, many stories passed from generation to generation were preserved. Some persons could memorize pages of text. Reading speed was very slow. These readings, which are far below modern reading speed, allowed the opportunity to enjoy every word. Listeners find the opportunity to digest every sentence, could grasp its meaning. This slowness was at the same time increasing concentration. Discussion sessions were an integral part of reading. Long talks are held about read texts. Different interpretations were made. These discussions develop critical thinking ability, taught different perspectives. Writing lessons were also given on winter nights. Persons knowing reading and writing tried to teach letters to persons not knowing. Trials of writing on stone with coal pieces are made. Basic writing skills were taught. Musical readings were special events. Some texts are read accompanied by music, presented as melodies. These presentations both sound pleasant to the ear and made memorization easier. Especially ballad-style stories were read in this way. Child education was an important part of reading sessions. Moral values, behavioral rules, and life skills were taught to children through these stories. Tale tellers were among the people children loved most. Language teaching was also done during these sessions. Latin texts were read, word meanings were explained. In this way, the public started to learn the Latin language, could understand church services better. Copying work was also the job of winter nights. Copies were made from valuable books. The spread of knowledge was ensured. This was a very difficult and patience-requiring job, but was necessary to protect knowledge. Story creation tradition also developed. Persons inspired by read stories made up new stories, used their imaginations. This creativity was both fun and instructive. Memory exercises were a part of reading activities. Memorizing long texts, remembering words, and transferring stories correctly provided memory development. This skill was very useful in daily life too. Moral teachings were the main purpose of stories. Distinguishing good and bad, correct behavior examples, and social rules were taught through these stories. In this way, social order is protected, values were transferred. Reading hours spent by candlelight in medieval castles were one of humanity's most beautiful traditions where knowledge and entertainment met. These beautiful moments are worth remembering as lights of knowledge illuminating the darkness of winter nights. The smell radiating from your body has started to disturb even yourself, but everything necessary for washing is in a frozen state. Water, soap, and even the place to wash are unusable. Your hair has become oily, your skin dirty, and your clothes covered with sweat, filth, and various stains. While hygiene was already difficult in the Middle Ages, winter months were making this difficulty almost unbearable, and cleanliness was ceasing to be a luxury and becoming a product of imagination. Basic conditions necessary to do cleaning in winter months were disappearing. Water sources freeze, soap hardens, and washing areas were becoming unusable. This situation was creating not only discomfort, but also serious health risk. Filth accumulation increases infection risk, would raise the possibility of catching disease. Water problem was the biggest source of hygiene problem. Wells freeze, water carrying system breaks down, and obtaining hot water was becoming almost impossible. The small amount of water that could be found is reserved for drinking and cooking purposes, was not used for cleaning. This situation was forcing people to live without washing for weeks. Soap production and supply were becoming very difficult in winter months. Handmade soaps harden in the cold, would become unusable. Animal fats used in soap making freeze, processing could not be done. Therefore, people had to try to clean themselves without soap. Washing areas were becoming dysfunctional in winter months. Open area baths become unusable, closed areas would be very cold. Bath technology is in such a primitive state that washing in places without heating systems could lead to hypothermia. Clothing change was also creating a big problem. Since finding spare clothes is difficult, people had to wear the same clothes for weeks. These clothes fill up and overflow with sweat, filth and smell would come to an unhygienic state. Washing laundry would become almost impossible. Hair care was one of the most neglected subjects. People unable to find hot water to wash hair were leaving their hair without washing for months. This situation was creating dandruff, itching, and even lice problem. Alternative methods are sought for hair cleaning, but these remained ineffective. Dental care was also quite bad. Since they did not have toothbrush-like tools, people were trying to clean their teeth with their fingers or pieces of cloth. Oral hygiene worsens, tooth decay and bad breath problem would become widespread. Various methods are tried to mask body odor, but these would be unsuccessful. Since perfume-like scents are very expensive, only the very rich could use them. The public tries to use herbal scents, but these could not be found in winter months. The hygiene problem for women was even more complex. Cleaning of hygiene materials used during menstrual periods was very difficult. Since pieces of cloth cannot be washed, they are used again and again. This would increase infection risk. Children were becoming the most vulnerable group regarding hygiene. Since adults cannot even do their own cleaning, necessary care could not be shown to child hygiene. This situation was leading to more disease risk in children. The situation was even more grave for the elderly. Elderly people already having difficulty doing cleaning due to physical limitations were remaining completely helpless in winter conditions. Since they could not get help, their hygiene situations would worsen very much. Hygiene problem was growing even more in communal living areas. Dining halls, bedrooms, and common use areas get dirty quickly. Since cleaning could not be done, this filth would continue to accumulate. This situation would make disease transmission easier. In case of illness, hygiene would become even more critical. While the cleaning need of sick people increases, winter conditions would make meeting this need impossible. This situation prolongs the healing process of the disease, could lead to complications. Kitchen hygiene was also creating a big problem. Washing dishes, cleaning the counter, and keeping food preparation areas hygienic was very difficult. This situation increases food poisoning risk, could lead to stomach diseases. Animal care was also increasing the hygiene problem. Since animals living inside the castle could not be cleaned, it was causing bad smells and disease risk. Animal feces cannot be cleaned, would create an unhygienic environment. Lack of hygiene in social life was creating a big problem. People refrained from approaching each other. Social distance would increase. This situation was leading to both psychological and social problems. Alternative cleaning methods are tried to be developed, but these remained insufficient. Dry cleaning, cleaning with snow, and herbal methods are tried, but real hygiene could not be provided. Disease transmission risk was the most serious result of hygiene lack. Infectious diseases spread quickly, epidemics could break out. In this case, the health of castle residents would enter serious danger. Morale collapse was the psychological result of hygiene problem. People start to be disgusted by themselves, lose self-confidence, and would enter depression. This situation lowers general quality of life, would reduce happiness level. Hygiene problems experienced in winter months in medieval castles were bitter experiences showing how valuable today's cleaning standards are. These difficulties were proving how important humanity's development regarding hygiene is. Loud voices coming from a corner of the Great Hall wake you up, and you realize that the discussion between two lords has now turned into shouting. The small disagreement that started this morning has now reached the point of a dual threat at handsword. The patience of nobles cut off from the outer world, forced to live between the same walls for months, has come to an end, and even the smallest spark has become capable of leading to big explosions. Spending winter in a medieval castle was a tough experience, requiring struggling not only with cold, but at the same time with anger and violence born of confinement. The closure brought by winter months was raising tension to the peak point among the noble class. These people, who could throw off their stress by hunting, traveling, and establishing communication with the outer world in normal times, were stuck with the same spaces and same people throughout winter. This situation creates psychological pressure. It could lead to big fights, even in the smallest subjects. Hierarchy conflicts were one of the most common fight reasons. The noble order inside the castle was complex, and everyone's position was constantly becoming a subject of discussion. Details like who will sit where, who will eat before whom, who will have the right to speak on which subjects were constantly creating tension. Inheritance subjects were also a big source of fight. Since deaths increased in winter months, inheritance issues were coming to the agenda frequently. Inheritance fights break out between siblings, between cousins, and even between spouses and friends. These fights would sometimes end bloody. Marriage agreements were also a source of tension. Engagement and marriage ceremonies organized in winter months were becoming areas where interests of different families conflicted. Families unable to agree on the marriage of young people could become enemies, could start fights that will last for generations. Commercial disagreements were also causing fights. Discussions start among nobles unable to agree on subjects like land ownership, tax rates, trade rights. These discussions were sometimes turning into violence. Money matter could end friendships, could create enmities. Military subjects were also creating conflict. Subjects like who will have which military rank, who will be bound to whom in war situation, how military expenses will be shared, were constantly becoming subjects of discussion. Even a duel could break out when disagreement was experienced in these subjects. Disagreements over women could create very serious fights. Rivalry breaking out between two men trying to attract a lady's attention could sometimes go as far as deadly duels. Love triangles were creating big dramas inside the castle. Prestige races were a constant source of tension. Subjects like who dresses better, who wears more expensive jewelry, who lives more luxuriously, were constantly becoming subjects of comparison. This competitive environment was creating jealousy and enmity. Even religious subjects could cause fights. Theological discussions start among nobles having different religious views. These discussions could turn into personal attacks. Religion was such a sensitive subject that a small disagreement could lead to a bigger fight. Alcohol consumption was intensifying fights. Since alcohol consumption increased during the winter months, drunken fights were becoming widespread. Nobles under the influence of alcohol were saying things they would not say in normal times and exhibiting behaviors they could not control. Disagreements were also arising regarding child education. Subjects like which child would be educated, how, from whom they would take lessons, and to which position they would be brought in the future were creating tension between families. Fights over the future of children could be very harsh. Even the dining table arrangement could be a subject of fight. Details like who will sit where, which meals will be served, who will receive service first were constantly creating discussion. Since these seemingly unimportant subjects were actually status indicators, they could cause serious conflicts. Hunting rights were also creating disagreement. Subjects like which hunting ground would be whose right, how hunting spoils would be shared, who would use hunting equipment were causing fights. Since hunting was a subject of both sport and prestige, the competition was very intense. Guest hosting subjects were also creating tension. Subjects like how incoming guests would be welcomed, who would host which guest, how expenses would be shared, were causing disagreement. Since hospitality was a matter of prestige, fights were breaking out. Fights among young nobles were particularly violent. The youth, being full of energy, lack of experience, and impatience, were intensifying the fights. Power races among young men were sometimes becoming uncontrollable. Female nobles were also getting involved in fights. Rivalry, gossip wars, and intrigues among female nobles were not less dangerous than men's fights. Women's fights could be more insidious, but just as effective. Elderly nobles could fuel or soothe fights thanks to their experiences. Some old lords were succeeding in pitting youths against each other, using fights for their own interests. Others were trying to seek peaceful solutions. Dual traditions were determining the way fights concluded. Disagreements becoming a matter of honor were tried to be solved with duels. These duels could sometimes result in death. Since duel rules were complex, new disagreements could arise. Reconciliation rituals had also been developed. Various ceremonies and rituals were applied to reconcile fighting parties. These reconciliation processes could sometimes be effective. Long-term friendships could be established. Noble fights experienced in winter months in medieval castles were striking examples showing human nature's reactions under stress. These fights were forming an integral part of castle life as both dangerous and inevitable social events. Your foot slips suddenly while reaching for the next step, and the stone railing you try to hold onto to stay balanced is covered in ice. As your body falls uncontrollably backward, the only thing passing through your mind is how this fall will end. In medieval castles, winter months were a dangerous period where every step carried a potential accident risk. Passing through stairs required courage, and daily life came nose to nose with death. Castle architecture was making falling accidents inevitable. Narrow and steep stairs going up to high towers, slippery stone steps, and insufficient railings were turning these already dangerous structures into death traps in winter months. With the addition of ice, stairs were literally becoming sliding tracks. Ice formation was occurring in various ways. Waters flowing from the roof freeze on steps. Condensation of breath moisture forms thin ice layers on surfaces. Water formed as a result of snow melting freezes at night, creating dangerous surfaces. These ice layers were often invisible, leading to sudden surprises. The most dangerous stairs were tower stairs. A person falling on narrow spiral stairs could roll down to the bottom. Such falls usually result in multiple fractures, sometimes could even end in death. Tower stairs were becoming even more dangerous, especially on windy days. The situation was even more grave for elderly castle residents. Elderly people whose mobility is already limited were remaining literally helpless on icy stairs. Recovery times after falling were becoming very long, complications were increasing. Some elderly people were never leaving their rooms due to fear of falling. For children, icy stairs were deadly traps. Children moving quickly because they are small and agile were losing control when they encountered ice. Child falls generally result in head trauma, could leave permanent damage. For pregnant women, stair accidents were creating double danger. These accidents, carrying risk for both mother and baby, were generally ending with tragic results. Since the balance of pregnant women is already off, the risk of falling was increasing. Stairs were extra dangerous for those carrying heavy loads. Persons whose field of vision is restricted, center of balance changed, could fall very easily on icy steps. Heavy loads they carried were causing additional injuries after falling. Night stair usage was becoming especially risky. It was almost impossible to see the ice in the dark. Candlelight provides insufficient lighting. Shadows could be misleading. In the silence of the night, sounds of falling from stairs were waking the entire castle. First aid opportunities after falling were very limited. Since there were no modern medical intervention methods, falling accidents were often leaving permanent damage. Bone fractures, wrong fusing, internal bleeding detection impossible. There was no head trauma treatment. The most common injury types were bone fractures. Arm, leg, rib fractures were among frequently seen injuries. Treatment of these fractures is done with primitive methods. Most of the time would lead to wrong healing. Mobility could be restricted permanently. Head traumas were the most serious injuries. Heads hitting stone steps could take heavy damage, lose consciousness, or even lead to death. Since brain hemorrhage diagnosis could not be made, many head traumas were resulting in death. Internal bleeding was playing the role of silent killer. Internal injuries not seen from outside could not be diagnosed, could not be treated. Even if the falling person looked normal, damage occurring in internal organs could lead to death over time. Spine injuries were leading to the most terrible results. Blows coming to the neck and back region could cause paralysis, could leave the person crippled for life. Spine injury treatment was impossible in that period. Fall psychology was also an important factor. Persons experiencing a serious fall once could develop fear of stairs, could become unable to maintain their normal lives. This fear leads to social isolation, would lower the quality of life. Protective measures were very limited. Simple methods like sprinkling salt, throwing sand, or laying straw are tried, but these remained insufficient. Adding railings or stair repair were very expensive and difficult jobs. Servants were the group most under risk. These persons, having to use stairs constantly, were facing big risk a few times a day. Servant deaths are met as normal. A new one would be brought in their place. Soldiers were also in the high-risk group. While falling from a place is already difficult for an armored soldier, it was becoming almost impossible in icy conditions. When an armored soldier fell, the injury severity was increasing. Rescue operations were also dangerous. Those trying to rescue the falling person are also exposed to the same risks. Second accidents could be experienced. Carrying a stretcher on stairs was almost impossible. Fall statistics were terrible. Stair accidents tripled in winter months. Death rates were increasing dramatically. At least one serious falling accident is experienced every day. A few deaths were occurring per week. These accidents, which also had serious social results, were upsetting family economies. Persons becoming unable to work become a burden for their families. Livelihood difficulties were experienced. Accidents experienced on icy stairs in medieval castles remained as bitter memories, showing how vital today's occupational safety standards are. When you open the pantry door slightly, the smell seeping in evokes mixed feelings. A blend of promising grain smell and worrying mold smell. While checking the food stocks you carefully accumulated for winter, you remember that they decrease a little more every passing day. A part of them starts to rot, and there are still months for spring to come. Being able to survive throughout winter months in the Middle Ages depended on the skill of being able to protect food from rotting, and this skill was literally becoming a life or death matter. Food preservation technology was the basic condition for survival in the Middle Ages. In this period, without modern refrigerator and canning technology, protecting food from rotting was an art branch requiring great mastery. Every family's ability to sustain its life depended on how well they applied these preservation techniques. Salting method was the most common preservation technique. Intense salt was used to protect protein sources like meat and fish. Salt prevents bacteria reproduction by drawing moisture, would slow down the rotting of food. However, if the salting process is not done correctly, foods could still spoil, could lead to salt waste. Drying method was one of the oldest preservation techniques. Fruit, vegetable, meat and fish were dried in the sun or wind, lowering moisture rate. Due to lack of sun in winter months, this method becomes difficult. Drying in closed areas was tried. Drying is done by the fire, but this could create fire risk. Smoking technique was used especially for meat and fish. Foods were kept under smoke for days in specially built smokehouses. Smoke kills bacteria and gave a special taste to the food. However, since this method required a lot of wood consumption, it was expensive. Storing in wine and vinegar was also a common method. Acidic environment prevents bacteria reproduction, kept food fresh for a longer time. Vegetables were stored in vinegar, meats in wine. The disadvantage of this method was that wine and vinegar were expensive. Protection in oil technique was used especially by rich families. Olive oil, butter, or animal fats were preventing rotting by isolating food from air. Although this method is effective, it found limited usage area due to oil cost. Storing under soil was an old but effective method. Root vegetables and grains were stored in specially prepared pits. The natural insulation of soil prevents temperature changes, provided constant humidity. However, rats and other rodents could damage these storages. Protection with honey was a luxury method. The natural antibacterial properties of honey were protecting food from rotting. Fruits and some meats could be stored in honey. Since honey is very expensive, it was used only for the most valuable foods. Fermentation technique was used for both protection and increasing nutritional value purposes. Cabbage is turned into pickle, milk is made into cheese, grains were fermented. Fermented foods both last longer and their nutritional value increased. Freezing protection was the natural advantage of winter months. Foods are stored in frozen state, rotting process was stopped. However, freezing thawing cycles could spoil the texture of the food, could lead to taste change. The art of pantry arrangement was very important. Correct sequencing of foods, ventilation systems and humidity control were conditions for successful storage. Wrong arrangement could lead to the spoilage of all stocks, causing hunger. Fighting mold required constant war. Mold spreads quickly in damp warehouses and could make a large amount of food unusable. Moldy parts had to be cleaned immediately, spreading had to be prevented. Pest control also carried critical importance. Rats, insects, and other pests were the biggest enemies of food stores. Cats are fed, traps are set, and storage areas were kept under strict control. Portion control required long-term planning. A consumption program to be followed throughout the winter is calculated in advance. Daily portions were determined. A balance had to be established between the risk of finishing early and the threat of hunger. Quality control was a job done daily. Foods stored every day are checked. Those starting to spoil were separated. Early intervention could prevent the loss of the entire stock, could provide partial recovery. Alternative protein sources were also evaluated. Due to the difficulty of finding fresh meat in winter months, efforts were made to obtain proteins from dried insects, fish bone powder, and bone meal. Water storing was a separate art. Special techniques are applied so drinking water does not freeze. Efforts were made to maintain its cleanliness. Since bad water could make the whole family sick, water quality was very important. Seed protection carried vital importance for the next year. Seeds for planting are protected specially, stored without rotting and without germinating. Losing seeds meant hunger for the next year. Backup plan preparation was also necessary. Emergency reserves to come into play when main food stocks spoiled were kept. These reserves generally consisted of the most durable and least preferred foods. Social cooperation was increasing storage success. Food sharing among neighbor families, information exchange, and common storage practices were increasing the chance of survival. The art of winter food storage in the Middle Ages was one of the most striking examples of tough struggles, showing how revolutionary a development modern food technology is. In your dream, you are lying under the sun on a tropical island. Your whole body feels warm and comfortable. But suddenly, you wake up, and in the real world, your teeth are chattering, your toes are numb, and you are trembling, curled up under blankets. Sleep has fled from you tonight too. The discomfort given by the cold will not allow you to rest. Winter sleeps in medieval castles were suffering hours spent dreaming of heat instead of real rest, and almost no one could get quality sleep. The body struggling with cold was disrupting the natural sleep cycle. The human body needs a certain temperature level to sleep. If this temperature cannot be provided, sleep quality would drop dramatically. The icy atmosphere of castle rooms was completely upsetting this natural cycle, leaving people sleepless. Climbing sleep, tense sleep, had become the most common problem. Body muscles, shivering from cold stretch constantly, could not find the opportunity to relax. This muscle tension prevents passing into deep sleep, was causing superficial and interrupted sleeps to be experienced. Dream contents had changed dramatically. The dreams of castle residents were constantly revolving around heat, sun, fire, and tropical places. These dreams were so common that even dream interpreters had started to accept this situation as normal. Waking frequency was increasing throughout the night. The cold wakes people up every half hour. Hours had to pass to sleep again. This constant waking-sleeping cycle leads to mental fatigue, was lowering the next day's performance. Sleep problems in children were in even more serious dimensions. Since their small bodies experienced heat loss faster, children cry throughout the night, were waking their parents. The whole family stays sleepless. Everyone's quality of life was dropping. The sleep situation of the elderly was the gravest. Their sleep patterns, which were already broken, were being completely upset due to the cold. Elderly castle residents stay awake for hours at night, were trembling until morning. Sleep was much more difficult in communal bedrooms. In situations where many people share the same room, everyone's sleeplessness affects each other. Constant activity was experienced in the room. When one wakes up, others also wake up. Mass sleeplessness was experienced. Nightmares had also increased. Physical stress created by the cold triggers fear dreams. People were seeing nightmares throughout the night. Fear of freezing to death reflects in dreams. Psychological traumas were being experienced. Sleep position was constantly changed, but comfort could not be found. People turned constantly throughout the night and continued trying to reach a position where they would feel the least cold. This constant movement was spoiling sleep quality even more. Difficulty waking up in the morning had become a widespread problem. People who cannot get quality sleep at night have great difficulty getting up in the mornings, were having trouble fulfilling their daily duties. Tendency to nap during the day had increased. Castle residents unable to sleep at night try to nap at any opportunity during the day, but this was spoiling night sleep even more. A vicious cycle occurs. The sleep problem was deepening. Common heating strategies had been developed. Families share their body heats by sleeping together. Children were laid between parents. Although this method works partially, it could create privacy problems. Dreaming of heat had become a sleep technique. People try to sleep by consciously imagining hot places, trying to warm themselves mentally. This technique sometimes worked. Alcohol use had increased as a sleep aid. People try to create a feeling of warmth in their bodies by consuming alcohol before sleeping, trying to benefit from its sleep-inducing effect. But since alcohol spoils sleep quality, it was creating problems in the long run. Breathing techniques had been developed. People trying to warm under the blanket by exhaling hot breath were doing special breathing exercises. Although this method provided temporary relief, it was not a permanent solution. Efforts to warm up with movement were being made. Leg movements in bed, finger exercises, and tensing, relaxing techniques were applied. These movements increased blood circulation, were providing temporary warmth. Hot drink rituals had become widespread. Efforts were made to warm the body from the inside by drinking hot tea, milky drinks, or spicy mixtures before sleeping. These rituals were also providing psychological comfort. Storytelling tradition was being used as a sleep aid. Efforts were made to provide mental warming by telling stories, talking about hot climates, sunny days. Prayer and meditation techniques were being used for sleep. People trying to forget the cold with religious prayers and mental focusing exercises were trying to relax with spiritual methods. Herbal mixtures are tried as sleeping pills but would not be very effective. Mixtures prepared with a small number of plants found in winter might provide temporary relief but could not solve the basic problem. Nurturing hopes for the future had become a sleep technique. People finding consolation with thoughts that spring will come, hot days will return, were trying to sleep by nurturing hope. Winter sleep problems experienced in medieval castles were bitter experiences, showing how valuable modern bedroom comfort is. These sleepless nights were tough tests, pushing the limits of human endurance. To get through the night, you lean on your dog's furry belly and feel a little relieved with the warmth you get from its body heat. Along with horse sounds coming from the barn below, the purr of the cat curled up at the foot of your bed also comes to your ear. In the Middle Ages, the relationship between humans and animals was not just a working partnership, but at the same time a struggle for mutual warming and survival. Animal heat had literally become a life-saving source. This valuable partnership had found its deepest meaning on winter nights. Dogs were not only guards in castle life, but at the same time a life-saving heat source. These loyal animals share their body heats by sleeping next to people on cold nights, providing natural protection against the danger of freezing. The tradition of sleeping with dogs was so common that almost every family kept at least one dog in their bedrooms. Castle dogs would be of various sizes. Large dogs were especially valuable because they produced more heat, but small dogs were also advantageous because they take up less space, could sleep more comfortably next to children. Dog selection was based not only on character and skill, but also on heat production capacity. Establishing close relationships with horses was also a common practice. Barn workers lie next to horses on cold nights. They benefited from the body heat of these large animals. Horse barns therefore become popular sleeping places in winter months. Space-grabbing races were experienced among servants. Cat friendship was especially common among women and children. Cats' high body temperature and ability to sleep comfortably made them ideal bed companions. A cat sleeping on your chest could provide warmth and comfort for hours. Poultry were also used for heating purposes. Chickens and geese are sometimes taken inside houses, sharing the same space with humans, especially on very cold nights. Although this practice had hygienic problems, it was tolerated because survival was the priority. The warmth of goats and sheep was also benefited from. Since these animals provided both milk and heat, they were bringing double benefits. Especially while sick children were fed with goat milk, at the same time they benefited from the goat's warmth. Locations of animal shelters are determined strategically, arranged to ensure maximum heat sharing. Barns and folds are built as close as possible to living areas. Quick access was provided when necessary. Communal living arrangement required complex rules. Subjects like which animal will lie where, who will sleep with which animal are determined with careful planning. Conflicts were tried to be prevented. Animal hierarchy could affect human hierarchy. Animal warmth would become even more critical in cases of illness. While cold application is necessary for patients with fever, hot animal contact could be life-saving for patients in hypothermia. Dogs and cats were literally serving as natural thermostats. Animal friendship was especially important for children. Since their small bodies experienced heat loss rapidly, children needed animal warmth more. Parents tried to protect their children by making them sleep with animals. The elderly were also providing great benefit from animal warmth. Since the aging body lost its capacity to produce heat, it needed external heat sources more. Elderly people with loyal dogs could live longer. Animal warmth was especially valuable for pregnant women. Increased heat need during the pregnancy process is tried to be met with animal friends. This closeness continued after birth too. Babies and small animals could grow up together. Sick animals were also taking warmth from humans. This mutual benefit relationship contributes to both animal and human health. Common healing processes could be experienced. While warming your sick dog in your lap, you would benefit from its warmth too. Providing animal food required joint effort. Since animal feed is scarce in winter months, people have to share their own food. This was increasing animal loyalty. A hungry animal meant a cold animal, and a cold animal would not give heat. Hygiene problems were serious, but in the background. Although animal parasites, smells, and filth are disturbing, these problems were tolerated because survival was the priority. Weekly cleaning routines were the condition for maintaining animal friendship. Security function was also important. Animals were functioning as both heat source and security system. Night guard dogs provide both warmth and protection, creating double benefit. Emotional bonds were also strong. Deep emotional bonds developed between people and animals living a survival partnership. These bonds could last a lifetime. This emotional closeness provided moral support on difficult winter nights too. Loss of animal would create great trauma. A person losing their loyal animal friend experiences great loss in terms of both emotional and physical aspects. They would pass difficult days until finding a new one. Nutrition sharing was subject to strict rules. When you share food with animals, careful planning was required so that both of you do not go hungry. This sharing was actually in the nature of an investment, because a fed animal would produce more heat. Seasonal changes were affecting animal relationships. Animal-human relationships that are distant in summer months become very close in winter months, returning to balance again with spring. The search for animal warmth in medieval castles formed one of the most sincere and functional examples of humanity's relationship with nature. This mutual benefit relationship brought along not only survival, but at the same time mutual love and loyalty. Good night.